Good vach. Bershus, with the permission of friends old and new. We completed the introduction to Pirkei Avot. Now let us begin Pirkei Avot itself. All of Pirkei Avot begins. Let's get it on. Let's go. Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. Moshe acquired the Torah from Sinai. Stop! Write that in there. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai. He received it from Sinai. Who did he get it from? Did he get it from the Rebbeinu Shalom or did he get it from Sinai? The Slonim Rebbe asks. He says, no, he didn't get it. He didn't get it from Sinai, the place itself. What he acquired, according to the Slonim Rebbe, and Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, was that once he realized that when Hashem placed the acquisition of the Torah and acceptance of the yoke of Torah on the lowest of all of the mountains around, he could have put it on the loftiest of mountains, and he could have put it on the plateau of any of the most majestic mountains, but Hashem chose the lowest mountain. And from this, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to discern from the lowest mountain, Sinai, that in order to acquire Torah, one must come with humility. So when it says Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, it means that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to intuit and discern and understand from the fact that Torah was given on Sinai, that in order to create a path to Torah, you must be humble. This is the meaning of Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. The Mishnah continues. Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, Msara Yeshua, and he gave it over, and it was transmitted to Yeshua. Yeshua's Gainim was Gainim, and Navim, Msara Lachiknasak Doilam. And then the Gainim and the elders, they gave it over to the prophets, and the prophets to the members of the great assembly. Everybody says, why is it necessary for me to have this little history lesson? I could have read Dubnov, I could have read Gretz, I could have read our modern day Jewish historian Rabbi Beryl Wein in order to get a history transmission and knowledge of each and every generation that actually received the transmission in oral Torah. But that's not the message that it is coming to teach us here in Pirkei Avot. What it is coming to teach us here is that in every single solitary generation, it is necessary to have your own leaders. Moshe in one generation, Yoshua in another generation, the Nevi'im in another generation, and the Anshe Knesset Hagdola in another generation. As all of Chazal are famously apt to quote, Yiftach bedoro kishmuel bedoro. Yiftach in his generation like Shmuel in his generation. But as always, I like to quote my father. My father, Rav Yaakov Simcha, used to say the name of the Rav Chaim Shmulevitz the following vort. In the times of the Gemara brings down in Tainus that our Jewish folk tales had our own Rip Van Winkle story, and our own Rip Van Winkle was called Choni HaMagal, Choni the Magal. You've all heard the name, Choni the Magal. Well, Choni the Magal went out into the fields one day and he fell asleep, and for many, many, many years he was asleep. And one day he awoke from his deep, deep slumber, and traveling along the road he made his way back to the Beis Medrash. And before he got to the Beis Medrash, he heard people arguing and debating points of halacha and debating Torah. And as he approached, he heard the din of Torah learning growing louder, and Talmidim and Talmidei Chachamim arguing about the fine points of Torah in and of itself. He comes into the Beis Medrash, Choni HaMagal, after many years of slumber. His whole countenance is different. And as he walks in, he hears them debate a specific area of Torah. And as they debate the specific area of Torah, one of the Talmidim says, if only Choni HaMagal were here, he'd be able to answer the kasha. Choni HaMagal hears this, he jumps up and he says, I'm Choni, I'm Choni. And they go, who? Choni's long gone. He's missing, he's dead. No one believed Choni when he kept screaming and protesting and adamantly arguing for the fact that it was me. It's me. I'm Choni. No one believed him. Not a soul. Dejected, he hung his head low and walked from the base medrash, came back to the pasture, laid his head down, and never woke up again. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz asks the following question. What's going on? What do you mean? If he says, I'm Choni, they should have believed him. He goes, no. So Rav Chaim Shmulevitz quotes this particular Mishnah. Moshe kibel Torah Sinai Musara Yoshua, and he gave it over to the next generation. Each generation gave it over to the next generation. What was the problem in this story? You see, Choni, he shouldn't have said, I'm Choni. He should have said, ask me a question, and I'll give you the answer. You see, Choni was out of touch. He no longer could relate to the language of the time. Instead of saying, I'm Choni, believe me, he should have simply said, ask me a question, and I'll provide the answer, and that way I'll prove it to you that I'm Choni. The fact that he couldn't even think to do that then meant that he could no longer represent the Jewish nation as its manig, as its leader. Every generation needs its leaders. Hey Mamru, Shlosha Dvarim. They said three things. They said only three things? No. They said many things. Many, many, many things. But here we are talking about the transmission and the continuity of Torah and Masorah. So in order to ensure the continuity of Torah and Masorah, for this, three maxims are important. And what are they? Hemidu Talmidim Harbe. You should stand up or create many, many, many students. Have a misunim badin, and you should be deliberate in judgment. V'yasu siyag l'Torah, and you should make fences around the Torah. Concerning transmission of Torah to another generation, my grandfather, Harav Meir Cohen, used to say the following on the words, Vishinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam. You shall teach it to your children, and you shall speak in it. You see, many, many parents, they become estranged from their children. They no longer have a common language to speak with them. The fads are different, the clothing is different, the sports is different, the stars are different, the movies are different, the music is different. There's nothing in common anymore to talk about. And therefore, children and their parents, they grow estranged from each other, they grow apart, and they no longer share a common bond. But my Zaidi, Rav Meir Cohen Zatzal, used to say, Vishinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam, if you'll teach it to them and you will talk to them in it. What are you going to talk in it? If you talk Torah to your children, if you talk in Torah to your children, it has withstood the test of time, and you will always have a common language with which to bond with your children and your grandchildren. V'dibarta bam, speak to them. Now, returning to our Mishnah, Hevu misunim badim. Be deliberate in judgment. Two famous grandfathers of mine, one Rav Meir Cohen Zatzal, and the other Rav Yaakov Naiman Zatzal. Rav Meir, when anybody would bring him a question, he would first say, did you ask your own rabbi the question? And if your rabbi has a shaila, then your rabbi can call me. And also, he wouldn't necessarily get back immediately with an answer. He would always be miyashiv. He would always deliberate on every question. in order to try to think of all the permutations in order to arrive at the correct answer for the individual who was asking the question. He was deliberate. There's another type of a person or individual who's deliberate. You know what kind of a person that is? When you ask them a question, right there on the spot, they give you an answer. Boom. My other Zaydi Rabbi Yaakov Naiman, on the spot, the answer would be forthcoming. Having misunim bidim, two paths in this particular type of Mishnah. Hamidu talmidim harbe. You should have a lot of students. The Paravicharov, Rav Kahneman, he suggested that there is a distinction between a yosem, an orphan, and a dor yosem, an orphaned generation. What's the distinction? Well, an orphan is an orphan and is a person without parents. But an orphan generation is a generation without children. If there are no longer any children around, there's nothing to teach to anybody anymore. We've just finished Pesach. V'higara to levincha. Teach it over to your children. To forestall an orphan generation, the Paravicharov suggested it is vital to generate, educate, and develop numerous students. Emidu talmidim harbe. And moidav v'raboisai v'yasu siyog l'Torah, and make fences around the Torah. Notice how some of our greatest heroes, our Torah sages from past and present, in even the slightest nuance of ritual, were so scrupulous. And it is these individuals who became our heroes of Jewish folklore. There are two orientations to being scrupulous and placing fences around the Torah. A fence around the Torah guards the mitzvah itself from dilution, but by the same token, over-scrupulousness in the adherence of fences around the Torah unfortunately leads to sin. We find this in the case of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, when they made a fence around the Torah. When they said, don't touch the tree, when only the prohibition was not to eat. This led further to their descent and ultimate exile from Eden. Moshe kibel Torah Misinej, Sarah Yoshua is Canaan L'Neviim L'Anshe Knesses Agdola Heim Hayu Heim Amru Shlosha Devarim Heim Misunim Badim Hemidu Talmidim Harbe V'Yasu Siyag L'Torah. You want to continue and ensure the future? These are the things that you must do. Good fach.